Ladies and gentlemen, today we explore the life and legacy of one of the most infamous figures in organized crime history, Paul Castellano. Known as Big Paul, he was a ruthless yet business-savvy leader who ruled the Gambino crime family until his violent downfall in 1985. Paul Castellano was born Constantino Paul Castellano on June 26, 1915, in Brooklyn, New York, into a world deeply entrenched in Mafia culture. His parents were Sicilian immigrants, and his father, Giuseppe Castellano, was a butcher who also had strong connections to the Mangano crime family, one of the 5 families of the New York Mafia. These early ties to organized crime would shape Castellano's future as he grew up surrounded by the traditions, rules, and expectations of the Cosa Nostra. Despite his later reputation as a businessman, Castellano was no stranger to violence and illegal activities. At just 19 years old, he was arrested for the first time in 1934 for armed robbery. After refusing to cooperate with the police and staying silent, a trait highly valued in Mafia circles, he gained respect among criminals. This earned him a stronger position within the Mafia, reinforcing the idea that he was a reliable and trustworthy figure within the underworld. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Castellano was more than just a street enforcer. He had a keen business mind. While many Mafia members focused on gambling, extortion, and drug trafficking, Castellano took a more strategic approach. He preferred to invest in legitimate businesses while still maintaining ties to illegal activities. His family's meat wholesale business gave him a cover for laundering money and controlling supply chains, which would later play a crucial role in his rise to power. During his early years in the Mafia, Castellano worked closely with some of the most feared and respected crime bosses in New York. He became a trusted associate of Carlo Gambino, who would later become the boss of the Gambino crime family, the most powerful of the 5 families. Through loyalty, intelligence, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary, Castellano solidified his place in the criminal underworld. His reputation as a calculated and patient strategist helped him move up the ranks quickly. Unlike the traditional muscle men who relied on brute force, Castellano positioned himself as a man who could balance violence with diplomacy. This approach allowed him to gain favor with powerful Mafia figures, setting the stage for his eventual rise to the top of the Gambino crime family. Paul Castellano's ascent within the Gambino crime family was not a sudden or accidental event. It was the result of years of careful positioning, strategic alliances, and the favor of one of the most powerful Mafia bosses in history, Carlo Gambino. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who built their reputations through sheer brutality, Castellano combined intelligence, business acumen, and loyalty to secure his rise in the world of organized crime. By the 1940s and 1950s, Castellano had already established himself as a key figure in the Gambino organization. He was involved in loan sharking, extortion, and illegal gambling, but what set him apart was his ability to diversify the family's income sources. He leveraged his family's wholesale meat distribution business to expand into legitimate enterprises, a move that allowed him to control industries from behind the scenes. His ability to mix legal business with illegal Mafia activities made him an invaluable asset to the organization. During the 1957 Appalachian meeting, a high-profile Mafia summit in upstate New York, Castellano was among the attendees. When the meeting was raided by law enforcement, he was arrested alongside dozens of other high-ranking Mafia leaders. However, like a true Mafia loyalist, he refused to cooperate with authorities and never revealed any details about the meeting. This act of silence, known as omerta, the Mafia's code of silence, further cemented his reputation as a man of honor in the criminal underworld. Castellano's rise accelerated in 1976 when Carlo Gambino, the longtime boss of the Gambino family, died of natural causes. Many expected Gambino's underboss, Aniello Neil Delacroce, to take over as the next boss. However, Gambino, in a controversial and strategic move, personally chose Castellano as his successor. This decision was based on Castellano's ability to modernize the Mafia and his preference for financial schemes over traditional street crimes. By the late 1970s, Castellano was firmly in control of the most powerful crime family in New York City. His leadership marked a shift in the Mafia's priorities. Instead of focusing solely on traditional rackets like loan sharking and drug trafficking, he emphasized white-collar crime. Under his direction, the Gambino family made millions of dollars through construction fraud, labor union corruption, and controlling the concrete industry. His control over the New York meat industry also gave him significant influence in the food distribution business, allowing him to launder money more efficiently than his predecessors. Despite his success in expanding the family's financial empire, Castellano's rise to power was not without controversy. Many of the Gambino family's street-level soldiers and capos were unhappy with his leadership, feeling that he was too distant and too focused on money rather than traditional mafia operations. This internal tension would later play a significant role in his downfall, as certain members of the organization, most notably John Gotti, began plotting against him. Paul Castellano's reign as boss of the Gambino crime family marked a significant departure from the traditional ways of organized crime. Unlike his predecessors, who focused on violent street-level operations, Castellano sought to turn the Mafia into a corporate-style empire, using legitimate businesses to hide illegal operations and generate enormous wealth. He believed that the Mafia's future lay not in petty crimes like extortion and drug dealing, but in high-level financial crimes, construction fraud, and union corruption. One of his biggest contributions to the Gambino family's success was his ability to blend illegal activities with legal business ventures. Castellano had a natural talent for business, and he used it to expand the family's power beyond the streets of New York. He invested heavily in the meat industry, trucking, labor unions, and the construction business, allowing the Gambino family to earn millions of dollars while maintaining a clean public image. His connections within New York's food distribution networks were particularly valuable, as they enabled him to control pricing, supply chains, and contracts, a form of organized crime that was much harder for law enforcement to track. Under Castellano's leadership, the Gambino family also played a major role in the concrete and construction industries. Through mafia-controlled labor unions, he was able to manipulate multi-million-dollar contracts for major infrastructure projects across New York City. His influence was so vast that no major construction project in the city could proceed without the Gambino family's approval, ensuring that the Mafia received a share of every deal. One of Castellano's most controversial policies as boss was his strict stance against drug trafficking. He understood that the federal government had started cracking down on the Mafia's involvement in narcotics, and he wanted to keep the Gambino family out of law enforcement's crosshairs. He forbade members of the family from dealing heroin and cocaine, fearing that it would attract too much attention and lead to increased legal trouble. However, this decision created tension within the organization, as many of the Gambino family's street-level members relied on drug trafficking as a primary source of income. This growing discontent would later become one of the key reasons for his downfall. Despite his success in turning the Gambino family into a multi-million-dollar empire, Castellano's business-oriented leadership made him unpopular among the family's traditional enforcers and hitmen. Unlike previous bosses who earned their power through street credibility and direct involvement in violent operations, Castellano was seen as more of a corporate boss than a true mafia leader. He rarely interacted with lower-level soldiers and instead operated from the comfort of his luxurious Staten Island mansion, known as the White House. His focus on wealth accumulation and white-collar crime distanced him from the core members of the Gambino family, many of whom still believed in the old-school mafia traditions of loyalty, respect, and personal involvement in criminal activities. As a result, Castellano found himself increasingly isolated from his own organization, setting the stage for internal conflicts that would ultimately lead to his downfall. As Paul Castellano solidified his rule over the Gambino crime family, his leadership style and personal choices created deep resentment within the organization. Unlike traditional mafia bosses who operated discreetly and maintained close relationships with their soldiers, Castellano lived in extravagant luxury, distancing himself from the men who carried out the family's dirty work. His lavish lifestyle and business-oriented mindset alienated many members of his own crime family, making him one of the most controversial bosses in Mafia history. One of the most symbolic representations of Castellano's extravagant lifestyle was his massive Staten Island mansion, famously known as the White House, due to its grand, white-columned architecture. This 17-room estate, equipped with an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a massive marble staircase, and top-of-the-line security features, became a symbol of his wealth and detachment from the street-level soldiers of the Gambino family. While previous bosses like Carlo Gambino had kept a low profile, Castellano lived in almost open arrogance, attracting unnecessary attention from law enforcement and earning the resentment of his underlings. His choice to surround himself with businessmen rather than traditional mafia enforcers further fueled the divide within the organization. Castellano preferred to conduct business meetings in the comfort of his mansion, inviting high-level associates and avoiding direct interactions with the street-level mobsters who carried out the family's extortion, loan sharking, and violent enforcement operations. This approach angered many lower-ranking members, who felt unappreciated and overlooked by a boss they rarely saw in person. Adding to the tension was Castellano's strict enforcement of rules that many saw as hypocritical. He forbade Gambino family members from engaging in drug trafficking, fearing that the federal government's increasing crackdown on narcotics would lead to severe legal consequences for the organization. However, despite his public stance against drugs, Castellano secretly profited from drug operations, particularly through his close ties with heroin traffickers from the Sicilian Mafia. This hypocrisy enraged many of his subordinates, especially those who relied on drug dealing for income and risked their lives while Castellano sat in luxury. His extravagant spending habits also played a role in his downfall. Castellano was known for wearing custom-made suits, driving expensive cars, and dining at the most exclusive restaurants, further distancing himself from the rough, street-smart enforcers who had built the Gambino family's reputation through violence and loyalty. His wealth and arrogance stood in stark contrast to the more traditional mafia bosses, who preferred to live modestly to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. Perhaps the final nail in the coffin was Castellano's personal scandals, which further damaged his reputation within the family. It was rumored that he was having an affair with his Colombian maid, Gloria Olarte, a shocking revelation that was seen as a sign of weakness and hypocrisy. In mafia culture, respect and personal discipline were crucial, and Castellano's publicly known infidelity made him appear vulnerable and unfit to lead. As discontent grew among the family's traditional enforcers and capos, a powerful faction, led by the ambitious John Gotti, began plotting against him. Castellano's detachment from the streets, lavish lifestyle, and perceived hypocrisy made him a target for those who believed the Gambino family needed a more hands-on, ruthless leader who understood the realities of mafia life. One of the most significant factors leading to Paul Castellano's downfall was his growing rift with John Gotti, a rising star in the Gambino crime family, who saw Castellano as an unworthy and detached leader. Gotti, who came from the old-school, street-level mafia, believed in the traditional ways of organized crime, respect, fear, and direct involvement in criminal operations. Castellano's leadership, however, was the complete opposite. He was a businessman rather than a street enforcer, focusing more on white-collar crime and surrounding himself with wealthy associates rather than mafia soldiers. This fundamental difference in philosophy led to a deep resentment that would eventually turn deadly. John Gotti had earned his reputation through violence and loyalty, working his way up the ranks by proving himself as a ruthless and reliable soldier. He was heavily involved in drug trafficking, despite Castellano's strict orders against it. Castellano had made it clear that any Gambino family member caught dealing drugs would face severe consequences, but many, including Gotti, ignored this rule because of the massive profits involved. In the early 1980s, Gotti's crew was making millions of dollars through heroin distribution, particularly in Queens and the Bronx. When Castellano found out that several members of Gotti's crew had been arrested on drug charges, he saw it as a direct challenge to his authority. He was furious and wanted to make an example out of them, believing that if he did not enforce his no-drugs policy, the Gambino family would attract too much attention from federal authorities. Castellano had already been under intense FBI surveillance, and he feared that the drug business would bring more heat to the organization. However, Gotti saw Castellano's reaction as hypocritical and self-serving. While Castellano claimed to be against drug trafficking, many believed that he was secretly taking a cut from Sicilian heroin operations. This double standard enraged Gotti and his supporters, who felt that Castellano was using the drug ban only to eliminate rivals while continuing to profit behind the scenes. The tension between the two escalated even further when Castellano began openly disrespecting Gotti and his allies. He saw Gotti as too reckless and too flashy, traits that he believed would attract unnecessary law enforcement attention. Castellano had always preferred a low-profile approach to leadership, much like his predecessor Carlo Gambino, who managed to avoid prison and die of natural causes. Gotti, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. He loved the spotlight, wore expensive suits, and frequented popular nightclubs, making him one of the most recognizable figures in the underworld. As Castellano's paranoia and distrust grew, he began isolating himself at his Staten Island mansion, rarely making public appearances or directly dealing with his men. This only further alienated Gotti and his supporters, who believed that Castellano no longer had the respect of the family. To make matters worse, Castellano appointed his own bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti, as his underboss, a move that angered many within the Gambino family. Traditionally, the underboss position was given to a respected and experienced mafia figure, but Castellano instead chose Bellotti, a man with no strategic experience, whose only qualification was his blind loyalty. Gotti saw this as a final insult and realized that his own life was now in danger. Castellano had already hinted that he wanted to get rid of Gotti and his entire crew for disobeying his orders on drug trafficking, and with Bellotti now acting as his right-hand man, it was only a matter of time before Castellano made his move. At this point, Gotti made a fateful decision. If he didn't act first, Castellano would eventually have him killed. This realization set the stage for one of the most infamous power struggles in Mafia history, leading to a dramatic and violent coup that would change the Gambino family forever. At BY 1985, tensions within the Gambino crime family had reached their breaking point. Paul Castellano, once the undisputed leader of the most powerful mafia family in America, had become increasingly isolated, paranoid, and out of touch with his men. Meanwhile, John Gotti, an ambitious and ruthless capo, had grown tired of Castellano's leadership and saw him as weak, arrogant, and unfit to lead. Castellano's growing list of enemies, combined with his failure to control internal tensions, made his assassination almost inevitable. The breaking point, Castellano's growing paranoia. In the months leading up to his assassination, Castellano had lost the trust and respect of many within the Gambino family. His harsh leadership style, strict rules against drug dealing, and preference for white-collar crime had alienated many capos and soldiers who thrived on the traditional mafia rackets like extortion, loan sharking, and drug trafficking. But perhaps the biggest mistake he made was openly considering the elimination of John Gotti and his crew. Castellano had already ordered the murder of several Gambino members suspected of defying him, and many within the family believed it was only a matter of time before he targeted Gotti. When Castellano learned that members of Gotti's crew had been arrested on drug charges, he was furious. To him, this was a direct violation of his no-drug policy, and he saw it as a challenge to his authority. He reportedly planned to have Gotti and his associates eliminated, believing that their recklessness was bringing too much heat to the family. Gotti, however, had his own sources within the family, and he quickly learned of Castellano's intentions. Knowing that his life was now at risk, he decided to act first. Instead of waiting for Castellano to strike, Gotti began secretly assembling a group of loyal allies to help him orchestrate a violent coup against the boss. The plan to kill Castellano. By late 1985, Gotti had gained the support of several powerful figures within the Gambino family, including Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, Frank DeCicco, and other key captains. These men had grown tired of Castellano's rule and saw Gotti as the future of the family. Together, they devised a bold and dangerous plan to remove Castellano permanently. The opportunity presented itself on December 16, 1985, when Castellano was scheduled to attend a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse, a famous Manhattan restaurant. This meeting was supposed to be a routine sit-down with his new underboss, Thomas Bellotti, and other high-ranking members of the family. However, Castellano had no idea that Gotti and his men had already planned an ambush. The assassination, a Mafia coup. On the evening of December 16th, Castellano and Bellotti arrived at Sparks Steakhouse in a black Lincoln Town car. They had no bodyguards with them, a fatal mistake that made them easy targets. As soon as their car stopped in front of the restaurant, a team of assassins, dressed in trench coats and wearing Russian-style fur hats, rushed toward them. In a well-coordinated and swift attack, Castellano was shot multiple times before he even had a chance to react. His body slumped onto the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath him as horrified pedestrians watched in shock. Seconds later, Bellotti, who was still seated in the car, was also gunned down in a hail of bullets. The assassins quickly fled the scene, disappearing into the crowded Manhattan streets before the police could arrive. Meanwhile, John Gotti sat nearby in a car, watching the entire assassination unfold from a distance. When he saw that the hit had been successful, he reportedly smirked and drove away, knowing that he had just orchestrated one of the most infamous Mafia hits in history. The aftermath, a new era for the Gambino family. With Castellano dead, the Gambino crime family was now leaderless, and within days, it became clear that John Gotti was the man in charge. Unlike Castellano, who had ruled from behind the scenes, Gotti was a flashy, hands-on boss who enjoyed the spotlight. He quickly moved to consolidate power, eliminating anyone still loyal to Castellano and rewarding those who had supported him. However, Castellano's assassination sent shockwaves through the Mafia world. Killing a boss without the approval of the Commission, the governing body of the Mafia, was considered a serious offense, and Gotti's bold, public execution of Castellano was seen as an unprecedented act of defiance. Many within the Mafia feared that this reckless approach would bring too much attention from law enforcement, and in the years that followed, their fears would prove to be correct. Paul Castellano's assassination on December 16, 1985, was one of the most defining moments in American Mafia history. His rise to power, leadership style, and ultimate downfall left a lasting impact on organized crime, shaping the future of the Gambino crime family and influencing how the Mafia operated in the years that followed. The end of white-collar Mafia leadership. One of the most significant consequences of Castellano's assassination was the end of the corporate-style Mafia leadership he had envisioned. Unlike his predecessor, Carlo Gambino, who successfully balanced traditional Mafia activities with a low-profile approach, Castellano had focused heavily on white-collar crime. He had attempted to transform the Mafia into a legitimate financial empire, prioritizing construction fraud, labor union influence, stock market manipulation, and other high-level rackets over traditional Mafia activities like loan sharking, extortion, and violent enforcement. However, his leadership style alienated many lower-ranking members, who felt that he was too detached from the realities of street-level crime. When John Gotti took over as boss, he immediately shifted the Gambino family back toward traditional Mafia operations, restoring the power of soldiers and street enforcers who had felt sidelined under Castellano's rule. This marked the end of the Mafia's experiment with white-collar crime dominance, as Gotti re-established the organization's focus on drug trafficking, extortion, and direct control over illegal businesses. The rise of John Gotti and the downfall of the Gambino family. With Castellano's death, John Gotti emerged as the new boss of the Gambino family, ushering in an era of bold, flashy leadership that contrasted sharply with Castellano's secretive, businesslike approach. Gotti became known as the Dapper Don due to his expensive suits, public appearances, and media-friendly persona. He openly flaunted his wealth and power, enjoying the spotlight in a way that no mafia boss before him had ever done. However, this approach came at a cost. While Castellano had successfully kept law enforcement at bay for most of his reign, Gotti's high-profile lifestyle drew massive attention from the FBI. Under Castellano, the Gambino family had operated with a sense of secrecy and caution, but under Gotti, the organization became one of the most targeted crime families in history. Within just a few years of Castellano's assassination, the FBI had launched a relentless campaign against the Gambino family, using wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations to dismantle the organization. One of the key figures in this effort was Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, a high-ranking Gambino member who had helped Gotti orchestrate Castellano's murder. When Gravano later turned informant against Gotti, it led to Gotti's conviction and life sentence in 1992. Ironically, Castellano's murder, intended to strengthen the Gambino family, ended up leading to its greatest downfall. The reckless manner in which Gotti took power caused internal instability and made the organization more vulnerable to law enforcement than ever before. Law enforcement's crackdown on the Mafia. The assassination of Castellano also had a wider impact on the entire Mafia world. By the mid-1980s, the FBI had already intensified its efforts to dismantle organized crime. But Castellano's highly public execution pushed law enforcement into overdrive. The brazen nature of the hit, carried out on a busy Manhattan street in front of a well-known restaurant, was seen as a sign that the Mafia had become too bold and reckless. The RICO Act, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which had been introduced in 1970, was now being aggressively used to take down Mafia families. Law enforcement began focusing heavily on wiretapping, surveillance, and turning high-level informants, leading to dozens of convictions within the 5 major Mafia families of New York. Castellano himself had been under federal investigation at the time of his death, and had he lived, he may have ended up in prison like many other Mafia bosses of his era. However, his violent removal from power accelerated the government's war on organized crime, making it harder for the Mafia to operate as it once had. The changing face of organized crime. Another major consequence of Castellano's assassination was the shift in how organized crime operated in the United States. While the Italian Mafia had long been the dominant force in New York and other major cities, the late 1980s and early 1990s saw the rise of other criminal organizations that capitalized on the Mafia's declining power. With increased FBI pressure and internal betrayals weakening the traditional Mafia families, new criminal groups, including Russian mobs, Latin American cartels, and Asian triads, began taking control of key illegal industries. Drug trafficking, which Castellano had once forbidden, became dominated by non-Italian criminal organizations, further reducing the Mafia's influence. Additionally, Castellano's corporate-style approach to crime was later adopted by modern organized crime syndicates, which use technology, banking fraud, and international money laundering to operate with more secrecy than the traditional Mafia ever could. Some historians argue that if Castellano's vision of a business-focused Mafia had survived, the Mafia might have evolved into a more powerful global criminal network, rather than being gradually dismantled by law enforcement. Castellano's legacy, a cautionary tale. Paul Castellano's legacy remains a subject of debate among Mafia historians. Some view him as an innovative leader who attempted to modernize the Gambino family and move it away from traditional street crime. Others see him as an arrogant and out-of-touch boss whose detachment from the family's lower ranks led to his downfall. Regardless of perspective, his rise and fall serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of internal power struggles, leadership detachment, and the inability to adapt to changing times. His death marked the beginning of the decline of the American Mafia, proving that even the most powerful criminal empires are vulnerable to internal betrayal and external pressure. Paul Castellano's life and death symbolize a turning point in the history of organized crime. His corporate approach to the Mafia, his detachment from the street soldiers, and his strict policies ultimately alienated the very men who were supposed to protect him. His assassination in the heart of Manhattan not only signified the brutality of mafia politics, but also set into motion a series of events that led to the eventual downfall of the Gambino crime family and the decline of the American mafia as a whole. While John Gotti may have won the battle by eliminating Castellano, he ultimately lost the war. His flamboyant leadership drew too much attention, leading to his imprisonment and the dismantling of the criminal empire he fought so hard to control. In the end, Castellano's murder was not just the fall of a man but the beginning of the mafia's decline in America, a legacy of violence, betrayal, and a changing world where the old rules no longer applied.